Hello, good afternoon. Should I start? I hope so. Yep, okay, good. So good afternoon, everybody. I am Roberta Pires de Oliveira. I'm from UFSC, Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, and I'm very happy to be the chair of this Abralin ao Vivo. Abralin ao Vivo, or Linguistics Online, is done by Abralin, Associação Brasileira de...
Can you please close your browser?
Me? So, good afternoon,
yes,
everybody.
Because
I am Roberta
your browser is
Oliveira.
open, so it's playing.
I don't know. I don't. So, que é para eu fazer?
Just close your browser. It must be open.
Linguistics Online is. I don't know what you're saying, so I don't understand. What's close my browser? That means close here, now. Oh,
yes, it's okay.
It's Go now. Ahead. It's okay.
Yeah, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so Abralin Online is from Associação Brasileira de Linguística, and it's done in cooperation with Comitê Internacional Permanente de Linguistas, Associação de Linguística e Filologia da América Latina, a Sociedade Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, Sociedade Espanhola de Linguística, Linguistic Society of America, and Sociedade Linguística Europeia, Australian Linguistic Society, Associação Internacional de Linguistique Appliquée, et British Association for Applied Linguistics. And I have the honor to introduce Lucas Champollion, who is an associated professor of linguistics at New York University. He holds a PhD in linguistics and a master's degree in computer and information science from University of Pennsylvania. His work has appeared in several journals, such as Theoretical Linguistics, Linguistics and Philosophy, Journal of Semantics, and Semantics and Pragmatics. He is specialized in semantics. He has written about event semantics, conjunction, disjunction, counterfactuals, and free choice. He has also published a book on distributivity, aspect, and measurement by Oxford University Press in 2017, called Parts of a Whole, Distributivity, a Bridge Between Aspect and Measurement. So it's a great honor to have you here, Professor Lucas Champollion. Thank you so much. And he's going to talk today about donkeys under discussion.
Thank you, Roberta. Thank you so much to everybody. It's a great honor to be talking here, and I'm grateful to Abralin, the LSA, and the other sponsors for giving me this opportunity to present my work and the work of my co-authors, Robert Henderson and Dylan Bamford. The title of this talk is Donkeys Under Discussion. And please give me a second as I start sharing my screen now. Okay, at this point, you should all be able to see the slides of this talk. And if you want access to these slides later on, you can also download them from the link at the top of the slides, which is tr.im/dd74. And this talk is based on a paper which has appeared in the Journal of Semantics and Pragmatics. And this paper is accessible at the other link at the top of these slides, which is doi.org/DD74. I'd like to thank my collaborators on this project, Dylan Bumford, who is a professor at UCLA, and Robert Henderson, who is a professor at the University of Arizona. There's 2 publications about this talk, Assault Proceedings and a journal article. And you should now be able to see, or you should have seen for a moment, the webpage to this journal article. So at this point, I'd like to start by introducing donkey sentences with some examples for those of you who might be new to the topic. So simply put, a donkey sentence is a sentence that contains a pronoun that's bound by an indefinite in the same sentence, but it's not C-commanded by that indefinite. Donkey sentences have a long history going back at least to the Middle Ages. The classical example of a donkey sentence is, every man who owns a donkey sees it. Now here, the pronoun that we call the donkey pronoun is at the end of the sentence, it. And its antecedent is the indefinite, a donkey. And as I said, the antecedent binds the pronoun but does not C-command it. Now, donkey sentences don't always have to be about donkeys. Here's another example. Every man who has a dime throws it in the parking meter. Now, in order to make sense of this example, imagine a town in which, in order to feed the parking meter, you need 1 dime. And what this sentence seems to say is that everybody who's supposed to feed the meter does so. Now, the embedding quantifier of the donkey sentence, that is, the quantifier that starts it, can be every, as in every man, every farmer, and so on. But it can be something else as well, as in 2 men who have an umbrella left it at home. All of these count as donkey sentences. And there's more examples involving embedding constructions other than quantifiers. For example, donkey sentences embedded by conditionals, such as, if a farmer owns a donkey, he sees it. I'm not going to talk about those donkey sentences in this talk, though. Now, before talking about donkey sentences, I should acknowledge that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. So probably donkey sentences are among the most popular topics of semantics. And what I'm going to present here is for what I'm going to present here, I'm indebted to many papers, including the ones cited here and more. And you can find references to all of these papers in the journal article that I mentioned at the outset of this talk. So what's so special about donkey sentences? There's many phenomena that syntacticians and semanticists and pragmaticists have studied. And here what I want to focus on is specifically the question about the truth conditions of donkey sentences. That is, the question about the circumstances under which a donkey sentence is judged to be true or to be false, or perhaps to have no truth value at all. So let's consider the original donkey sentence, the classic example. Every farmer who owns a donkey beats it. And let's consider a scenario in which we have 3 farmers, Jake, George, and Giles. And let's imagine that Jake has a donkey and beats it, and George has a donkey and beats it, and Giles has 3 donkeys and he beats all 3 of them. Now, in this scenario, the donkey sentence at the top of the slide seems clearly true. Now imagine that Giles does not beat any of his 3 donkeys. Here we would say that the sentence is clearly false. But now consider the scenario here, which is a kind of mixture between the two that we have seen so far. As before, Giles owns 3 donkeys, but this time he beats one of them and not the other 2. Now, is it true that every farmer who owns a donkey beats it? Or is it false? Or is it maybe neither true nor false? The best we can say out of context is perhaps that it is not so clear. And semanticists have hesitated to give judgments about this kind of sentence and this kind of scenario, which I'm going to call a mixed scenario. That is to say, a scenario in which someone owns multiple donkeys and doesn't treat all of these donkeys the same way. For example, Irina Heim in a paper in 1982 says her intuitions vacillate. I'm sorry, in her PhD thesis in 1982. Ruth in 87 says, I'm simply not sure. There's a proposal by my colleague at NYU, Chris Barker, from 1996, in which he suggests that certain donkey sentences presuppose that the scenario isn't mixed. That would amount to saying that in a scenario like the one we've just seen, the donkey sentence we've just seen, the one at the top of the slide, is neither true nor false. It's a presupposition failure. Now, to make things confusing, there are many other mixed scenarios in which people do have clear intuitions. And some of these scenarios involve the very same donkey sentence that we've been looking at. This is a kind of tongue-in-cheek scenario. It's credited by Chiacchia to Paolo Casalegno. So you have to imagine a community of farmers, and they're very stressed out. They keep fighting with one another. And eventually, they decide to go to see the local psychotherapist. And she recommends that every farmer who has a donkey should beat it and channel his aggressiveness in this way. Okay, so let's test our intuitions again, but this time keeping this scenario in mind. Again, let's imagine that in our little community, there are 3 farmers, Jake, George, and Giles. 2 of them own 1 donkey and beat it, and the third owns 3 donkeys and he beats only 1 of them. Now, people have observed that in this kind of scenario, the sentence this time feels clearly true. Now, I mentioned at the outset that there is a wide range of types of donkey sentences. And some of the sentences that I'm going to show you guys in this talk involve embedding by every. Some of them involve embedding by no. And there is another dimension along which they vary, which is that some of them seem to be paraphrasable as one of his donkeys, and others seem to be paraphrasable as all of his donkeys. For example, the sentence we're looking at now, every farmer who owns a donkey beats it, in the scenario we've been looking at here, seems to be true under the same conditions as a sentence like this. Every farmer who owns a donkey beats one of his donkeys. Because after all, that sentence is also clearly true in the scenario that we're looking at on this slide. I'll call that an existential reading. There's other donkey sentences in which the donkey pronoun has what I'll call a universal reading. And I'll walk you through some of these examples in just a few moments, but this slide gives us a summary of different kinds of examples with different kinds of embedding quantifiers and different kinds of readings. For example, if we take a sentence like this, every man who has a hat will wear it tonight. And if we ask ourselves how we can paraphrase the donkey pronoun, then it seems like the right paraphrase in this case is some of his hats, or in fact, one of his hats, because the other paraphrase, all of his hats, would make no sense. For the sentence to be true, all that has to be the case is that every man who has a hat will wear one of his hats tonight. We'll look at the other types of donkey sentences in a few moments, but at this point, let me pause and see if there's any questions from the audience.
Maybe I should have said before, if you have questions, you may ask questions of clarification during Lucas Champollion's presentation. So this is, right now we don't have any questions, Lucas.
Okay, good. Let me go on then. Now, I mentioned that universal donkey pronouns can be paraphrased as something like all of his donkeys, or all of his hats, all of his umbrellas, and so on, while existential donkey pronouns can be paraphrased as some of his donkeys, some of his hats, or sometimes any of his donkeys, any of his hats. And this raises the question, how is it possible that a pronoun can be understood in these two different ways? And there's an old idea that suggests that the answer lies in a connection with another phenomenon that is known to behave in a similar way, namely plural definites. A plural definite is something like the books. It's been observed a long time ago that a sentence like the books are in Dutch seems to have truth conditions that are similar to those of donkey sentences in the following sentence. If all of the books are in Dutch, the sentence is clearly true. If none of the books are in Dutch, the sentence is clearly false. And if some of them are in Dutch and the other ones are not, then it seems maybe doubtful, maybe dependent on context. In any case, the status of the sentence seems to be not so clear. This phenomenon is known as homogeneity. It also occurs when we put negation in the sentence, as in the books aren't in Dutch, which is one reason that people in semantics have been interested in homogeneity. In the 1990s, it has been observed that there's a similarity between plural definites and donkey sentences. Take a sentence like, the windows are shut, or the windows are open. As we'll see in a few slides in detail, in some circumstances or scenarios, this kind of sentence can be understood as making a claim about all of the windows, and in other scenarios, about some of the windows. Likewise, a sentence like, everyone with a window keeps it shut, or keeps it open, that is to say, a donkey sentence in which the pronoun talks about windows, or refers to windows, this sentence similarly can be understood as what we've called a universal or an existential reading. And so the idea by Yoon and by Krivka in the 1990s was that in order to understand why donkey pronouns are sometimes universal, sometimes existential, we should give them the same semantics as definite plurals, so that the donkey pronoun it has the same semantics as the definite plural, the windows. Now, if this was all there is, then I could stop here. However, Kanazawa in 2001 shows in great detail that the donkey pronoun it cannot in fact have the same kind of reference as a definite plural. And this is because the standard analysis of definite plurals involves sums. The idea is that a definite plural like the windows denotes that which you get when you put all of the windows together. You can think of it as a set. The formal term for this is a sum, because the underlying theory is mereology, the theory of parts and wholes, rather than set theory. But the details don't matter here, because what Kanazawa points out is that there is an important difference between donkey pronouns and definite plurals, which is the following. A definite plural is compatible with collective predicates, a donkey pronoun is not. For example, a sentence like this, which involves a collective predicate and a definite plural, is grammatically correct. Every donkey owner gathers the donkeys at night. Now, the corresponding sentence with a donkey pronoun, everyone who owns a donkey gathers it at night, is crashingly bad. It is ungrammatical. And we feel, or native speakers feel, that the reason that it's ungrammatical is that a single donkey cannot gather or be gathered. And that makes sense if the referent of the donkey pronoun it is a single donkey. But it does not make sense if the referent of it is the sum of donkeys, because after all, in the first sentence, it is precisely this sum of donkeys which is denoted by the definite plural, the donkeys, and which is compatible with a collective predicate. So, even though there are similarities between donkey sentences and sentences with definite plurals, we cannot exploit these similarities by postulating the same semantics for donkey pronouns and definite plurals. Roberta, are there any questions in the audience?
No, so far, no. Nobody has any questions.
Okay, very good. Now, in this talk, we're going to resolve this puzzle in the following way. We're going to argue that the parallel between sentences with donkey pronouns in them, that is, donkey sentences, and sentences with definite plurals in them, should not be thought of as a parallel between the pronouns and the definite plurals themselves. Instead, it should be thought of as a parallel between the entire sentences. Specifically, we're going to argue that the parallel consists in the fact that both sentences with definite plurals in them and donkey sentences have what we call a trivalent semantics. That is to say, under some circumstances, the semantics assigns them the truth value neither, rather than true or false. And the role of the pragmatics is to take this truth value gap and fill it either with truth or with falsity, depending on what the context specifies. Now, in order to make sense of this idea formally, we're going to do two things. We're going to import a theory of pragmatics that takes trivalent sentences. That is, it takes sentences with truth value gaps in them, and it assigns the truth value gap a classical truth value, either true or false, depending on the context. So it's a theory that turns trivalent into bivalent truth conditions. Specifically, we're going to use the theory of Manuel Krisch, which was developed for definite plurals, and we're going to adapt it to donkey sentences. Now, the other part of the theory is something I won't focus on in this talk so much unless people have questions about it. The other part is a semantic theory, which serves the trivalent truth values up to the pragmatics. That is to say, a semantics which makes sure that donkey sentences come out as being sometimes true, sometimes false, sometimes neither true nor false. For this component of the theory, which we describe in the paper, we built on compositional discourse representation theory, which is in turn based on discourse representation theory, which many of you are probably familiar with. Now, part of what we want to do is explain how different contexts can disambiguate donkey sentences. That is to say, we want to explain why, even though, according to us, a donkey sentence is neither true nor false as far as the semantics is concerned when we have a mixed scenario, we want to explain that even despite this fact, when we look at a sentence in a scenario, it is typically often understood as having a clear truth value, as being clearly true, or as being clearly false. We also want to understand why one and the same donkey sentence can be understood in some contexts as clearly true, in other contexts as clearly false. And as I said, we also want to be able to derive the semantic ambiguity compositionally by using a trivalent semantics, specifically a dynamic semantics, which serves up truth value gaps to the pragmatics. The central claim that we'll defend and that we are making in the paper is that the apparent complexity of what we're calling the existential universal dichotomy in donkey sentences follows from the interaction of two systems, each of which is relatively simple and independently motivated. The first system is a pragmatic account of how context disambiguates plural definites and donkey sentences. And the second system is a lean dynamic semantics, which leaves truth value gaps for the pragmatics to fill. And as I mentioned today, I'll focus on the first point. The full account, including the second point, can be found in a paper at doi.org/DD74. Now, in order to make the gist of our pragmatic theory easier to understand, let's look at some pictures. And in these pictures, I'll use the following convention. I'll represent entities in the denotation of the verb phrase in black, and those not in the denotation of the verb phrase in gray. For example, let's take a sentence like this. Every farmer who owns a donkey pays taxes on it. Now, I think that this sentence is most naturally as understood as being false in a scenario like the one we're looking at right here. That is to say, a mixed scenario in which there is a farmer who has 3 donkeys and who pays taxes on only one of them. In this case, the donkeys in black are those for which their owners pay taxes. The ones in gray are those for which their owners don't pay taxes. Now, it's been noticed before that the pragmatic interpretation of a donkey sentence, that is, the interpretation of an utterance of a donkey sentence in a specific context, is influenced by goals, for example, by the goals of the speaker. Here's an old example adapted a little bit. Anyone who catches a Zika fly should bring it to me. Now, suppose that you get this instruction from a scientist who's looking for a sample, and you catch several flies. Now, should you bring all of the flies to the scientist, or is it enough to bring just one of the flies as far as the scientist's instructions are concerned? It seems here that it is enough to bring just one. So if we're talking to a scientist, it seems that this is an existential reading. But now imagine a health official who's trying to eradicate the entire species of flies. Now, clearly, this health official will not be satisfied unless you bring all of the flies that you catch to them. So one and the same donkey sentence can vary in its pragmatic interpretation depending on the context surrounding it. And it's been known that definite plurals work in a similar way. Take the sentence, the doors are open, for example, and imagine that we have a gentleman who wants to reach a safe. He looks like a farmer here. Think of him as a robber. And he's trying to reach the safe by going through 3 doors in sequence. The only way he can reach the safe is if all 3 doors are open. And now let's imagine that the first and the second door are both open, but the third one is closed. Now, in this scenario, the sentence, the doors are open, seems to be clearly false. Imagine, by contrast, that the doors are arranged in parallel, so that as long as even one of them is open, our robber gentleman can reach his goal. Now it seems that as long as the doors are not all closed, and in particular, if two of them are open, even though the third one is closed, still the sentence "the doors are open" seems to be true this time. Now, to make sense of this, Malamud and Krish and others have proposed that as far as the semantics is concerned, a sentence like "the doors are open" is clearly true only if all of the doors are open. It's false only if no door is open. And in mixed scenarios, like the ones we've just seen, the semantics, as opposed to the pragmatics, assigns it the third truth value, neither true nor false. And then the pragmatics comes in and fills this gap with either truth or falsity. Specifically, Krish assumes something that he calls the current issue, we call the question under discussion, following work by Craig Roberts and many others. The question under discussion is, intuitively speaking, it's a salient question. And this question gives rise to an equivalence relation on possible worlds. The idea is that if two possible worlds agree on whether the answer to the question under discussion, then they are equivalent for current purposes, or QUD equivalent. We'll see some examples of this in just a moment. Now, if you have a sentence that's uttered at a world W0, then the pragmatics will assign the sentence the truth value true, even if the semantics assigns it the truth value neither at that world, so long as the semantics assigns it the truth value true at some other world, maybe some other world, which is equivalent to the actual world. If that's not the case, that is to say, if the sentence is either false as far as the semantics is concerned, or if the semantics says it's neither true nor false, and there is no world at which the semantics would say it's true among those that agree with the actual world on the question under discussion, then the pragmatics assigns it the truth value false. We'll see some examples of this in a few moments. Now, the question under discussion is not always taken to be an explicit question. That is, typically, we talk as if we are answering certain implicit questions, even though nobody has asked them or uttered them outright. Now, this means that in order for speakers and hearers to communicate, they need to agree on the question under discussion. Now, how do they do that if the question under discussion is left implicit? Krish suggests that there are a number of principles that everybody is assumed to obey, perhaps along the lines of Gricean maxims, that allow speakers and hearers to infer and cause one another to infer questions under discussion, even without uttering these questions outright. For example, Krish assumes that a sentence can be used to address a question under discussion only if no world where the sentence is true is equivalent with any world where the sentence is false. So intuitively speaking, the sentence needs to be aligned with the question under discussion. He also assumes Grice's maxim of quality, but with a twist. Remember that that maxim normally says that a speaker may use a sentence only if they don't believe it to be false. Well, Krish weakens that a little bit by saying a speaker may use a sentence only if they don't believe the actual world to be equivalent for the purpose of the question under discussion with any world where the sentence is false. What that means is, it is okay under certain circumstances to use a sentence in response to a question and a discussion, even though the sentence is semantically speaking neither true nor false at the actual world. Roberta, any questions at this point?
No, there are no questions to until now. So
Okay.
I think you can go on.
Sure. So one important fact about the theories that we're building here and that we're discussing is that this truth value gap is taken to be something different from a presupposition. And to see what I mean, think about what it means to accommodate a presupposition. Accommodating a presupposition, at least when we're talking about global accommodation, amounts to conjoining the presupposition with the at issue meaning. Now, filling the truth value gap of a definite plural, and according to us, a donkey sentence with truth, amounts to disjoining the truth value gap with the at issue meaning. The point here is that turning worlds from neither to false amounts to conjoining. Turning worlds from neither to true amounts to disjoining. So if you will, presupposition and homogeneity are mirror images of one another. Okay, it's time to look at some examples. I'll first present Krish's theory as it applies to definite plurals, and then I'll go on and show how it applies to donkey sentences. Here's again our scenario, this time with just two doors to make it simpler. The two doors are in parallel so that it's enough in order to reach a safe if one of them is open. So let's assume that the question under discussion is, can we reach the safe? And in response to that question, B says, the doors are open. Now, remember that in the scenario we're looking at, this sentence was judged true. How does Krish's theory account for this? Well, in the actual world, even though only one of the two doors are open, the safe is reachable. Now let's consider two non-actual worlds. The world on the left, in which both doors are open, and the one on the right, in which both doors are closed. Now, in the world on the left, the safe is reachable, just like at the actual world. This means that the world on the left is equivalent for the purposes of the question and a discussion with the actual world. But the world on the right differs from both the world on the left and from the actual world in that the safe is not reachable. What this means is that the actual world is equivalent for current purposes with the world on the left, but not with the world on the right. Now remember that the semantics assumes that the sentence, the doors are open, is neither true nor false at the actual world. The pragmatics takes this truth value gap and fills it with either truth or falsity. And in this case, because the actual world is equivalent to a world at which the sentence is true, namely the one on the left, the pragmatics replaces neither with true. So we call a sentence true enough if the semantics assigns it the truth value neither at the actual world, but the pragmatics assigns it the truth value true at the actual world based on the fact that some other world at which the sentence is semantically true is equivalent to the actual world. Now let's look at the, yes.
We have a question, maybe.
Yes, great.
What is the QUD in the doors are open, doors, without a bare plural scenario?
Oh, very interesting. At this point, we haven't looked at bare plurals. I know that there's a lot of interest in Brazil in bare plurals. So I'll just leave it at that, because in this talk we are focusing on donkey sentences. But perhaps at the end of the talk, we can come back to this and I can speculate about other applications of Krish's theory. I should say that Krish applies his theory only to definite plurals, neither to bare plurals nor to donkey sentences.
Okay. And
Okay.
maybe can I make a question
Sure.
about this scenario? I wouldn't say that it's true in the scenario that you have now. I would say it's false, even if there is one door open.
Ah.
Because of the plural, exactly because of the plural.
Ah, interesting. Yes. And would you say that it is true in a scenario where we have two doors and, sorry, three doors and two of them are open? And yes, I see. Yes. So Krish's theory does not deliver us that. And one could imagine different ways to account for this fact, perhaps pragmatically by appealing to competition of the definite plural with the singular. Neither Krish nor we do that. So at this point, I'll just leave it as is. In any case, for donkey sentences, it will turn out that this is not a problem because, as far as I know, we can't find a corresponding phenomena. But it's a very good point. Thank you. Okay. Now let's go on, still looking at Krish's theory. Let's go back to the case in which the doors are arranged in sequence. And let's imagine that one of the doors is open, the other one is closed. And so at the actual world, the goal, the path to the safe is blocked. So again, let's imagine we have the same question under discussion. Can we reach the safe? And the same sentence, the doors are open. In this case, the sentence is judged false. Krish's explanation of this fact is similar to the previous one. Let's consider two more worlds. The world at the top, where both doors are open and the safe can be reached, and the world at the bottom, where both doors are closed and the safe is blocked. This time, the actual world is equivalent to the world at the bottom, because the safe is blocked in both cases. Now, as before, the semantics assigns the truth values true, neither, and false to our three worlds. And this time, unlike in the previous example, the pragmatics does not assign the middle world, the actual world, the truth value true. It assigns it the truth value false, or if you prefer, not true enough. And that's because it is not equivalent to any world at which the semantics assigns the truth value true. So much for Krish's theory. Now, before I go on to show how it can be extended to donkey sentences, let's see if there's any more questions.
Yes, there is one more question, but I think maybe we should leave it for the end because it's like a more general question.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, let's look at donkey sentences. Remember the scenario that we were considering. The farmers are stressed out. They fight all the time. They see the local psychotherapist. She recommends that every farmer who has a donkey should beat it in order to channel his aggressiveness. And let's imagine that we have two farmers. One of them owns one donkey and beats it, and the other one owns two donkeys and beats one of them, but not the others. Now, in this scenario, the sentence is judged true. And intuitively, this seems to be because in this scenario, every farmer channels his aggressiveness. So here we're assuming, kind of tongue-in-cheek, that if you have two donkeys and you want to channel your aggressiveness, it's enough to beat one of them. Okay, so the actual world answers the question with yes. Let's again consider two worlds. The one on the left in which there's an excess of donkey beating. So the farmer at the bottom beats both of his donkeys, therefore channels his aggressiveness just like in the actual world. And the world on the right, where the farmer who owns 2 donkeys doesn't beat either of them, and therefore does not succeed in channeling his aggressiveness. So here, the actual world is equivalent for current purposes to the world on the left. The semantics assigns the truth value true to the world on the left, and neither to the world to the actual world, and false to the world on the right. And as before, because the semantics assigns true to some world which is equivalent to the actual world, the pragmatics then assigns true, or true enough if you prefer, to the actual world. So far for an existential sentence. Now let's look at a universal donkey sentence. Every farmer who owns a donkey pays taxes on it. Now here, let's imagine that if you own a donkey, you need to pay taxes on that donkey. If you own 2 donkeys, you need to pay taxes on both donkeys, and so on. And let's imagine that we have a farmer who owns two donkeys and who pays taxes on only one of them. So it seems that the sentence is false because of this farmer. Why could this be? Well, let's imagine that the question under discussion is whether anyone is breaking the law. And at the actual world, the answer is clearly yes, because we have a farmer who owns 2 donkeys and doesn't pay taxes on both of them. Now let's imagine again 2 worlds. The world on the left has everybody pay taxes on all of their donkeys. The world on the right has the second farmer paying taxes on neither of his donkeys. On the world on the left, nobody is breaking the law. On the world on the right, the second farmer is breaking the law, just like in the actual world. The truth values, according to the semantics, are true, neither, and false as before. And as before, according to the pragmatics, the middle world, the actual world, is judged not true enough. One more example, this time involving the donkey sentence, no man who has an umbrella leaves at home on a rainy day. This is due to Irene Heim. Now think about what the sentence means. Basically, what we need to think about is what needs to happen in order for the sentence to be judged true. Clearly, this sentence depends on people's umbrellas and what they do with them, whether they leave them home or whether they take them along. So let's think about umbrellas. Let's depict umbrellas that are left home in black. And I'll use a little home symbol, a house symbol, so that it's clearer. And umbrellas that are taken along are gray. And now the critical case. Let's imagine a world in which one gentleman has 2 umbrellas. He leaves one of them home and takes the other one with him. So you can imagine that the umbrella on the left, on the top left, is this man's favorite umbrella. And the umbrella on the right, the one that's in black, is an old umbrella that the man never uses. Now clearly, this man will stay dry. There's no need to take more than one umbrella along in order to stay dry. So we judge the sentence true. Plausibly, this is because we judge the sentence against the background of a question and a discussion like this. Does everyone have an umbrella with him? In the actual world, that's the case. The world on the left has our gentleman who owns 2 umbrellas take them both along. The world on the right has him leave both at home. On the world on the left, everybody still has an umbrella with them. On the world on the right, that's not the case. So the actual world is equivalent for current purposes to the world on the left, but not to the world on the right. And again, since the semantics assigns the sentence true on the world on the left, that makes the sentence true enough and therefore judged true at the actual world. And the last example, no man who has a 10-year-old son gives him the car keys. I'll show sons that get the keys in black and with keys, and sons that don't get them in gray without keys. Now think about this sentence for a moment and imagine that we have a man who has two sons. Both of them are 10 years old, and he gives one of them the car keys and not the other. And then we have another man. He has only one son. He does not give him the keys. It seems that this one son who received the keys is enough to make the sentence false. To account for this, let's assume that the question under discussion is something like this. Does every father behave responsibly? In the actual world, that's clearly not the case. It would be the case in a world like the one on the left, where the father of two sons gives neither of his sons the car keys. It would not be the case in the world on the right, where the father of two sons gives both of his sons the car keys. So the actual world is equivalent to the world on the right, but not to the world on the left. So once again, the actual world is not equivalent to any world at which the semantics assigns the donkey sentence the truth value true. And so, pragmatically speaking, the sentence is not true enough. I'll give one more example, and then I think I'll stop as far as the examples are concerned. Every man who has a hat will wear it tonight. Remember that this does not require anyone to wear more than one hat at a time. So in particular, if Al owns two hats and he will wear one of them, but leave the other one at home, we judge the sentence true. If let's skip this. So the theory so far says the following. In order to assign truth conditions to donkey sentences, the context is central. The donkey sentences and the sentences with definite plurals in them are similar in this respect, but the similarity is not at the level of the semantics, but at the level of the pragmatics. That is to say, we have not assumed that it is the donkey pronouns that are equivalent to the definite plurals. We have only assumed that it is the donkey sentences that are equivalent in some sense to sentences with definite plurals in them. They're equivalent in the sense that both of them have trivalent semantics, and both of them are treated the same way by the pragmatics. What this means is, at this point, we have not committed to any specific semantics for donkey pronouns, and in particular, we have not committed to a semantics involving sums. We have not committed to making donkey pronouns have the same semantics as definite plurals. We also haven't committed as to whether the truth value gaps are presuppositions or not. This is a question on which previous authors have disagreed. Barker claims that donkey sentences with truth value gaps in them are examples of presupposition failures. Krish, who talks about plural definites, looks at plural definites quite in detail and finds that they don't parallel with sentences with presuppositions. This is a difference between presupposition and homogeneity that I talked about earlier. Roberta, are there any questions?
Yeah, there is one that maybe you could clarify now.
Sure.
What about if there is no question under discussion, or if there are more than one, if there are multiple questions under discussion?
Right. So in the case where there is no question under discussion, what we assume is that people will either try to infer one, or they will not be sure, they will not know what to do, and they will either reject the sentence if the scenario is mixed, or their intuitions will vacillate. Typically, this is not the case in ordinary conversations, but it can be the case when linguists present examples out of context or ask themselves about the truth conditions of donkey sentences in the absence of any context. So we would submit that the reason that authors like Ruth and Heim say things like they vacillate between the existential and the universal reading, or they are simply not sure, and the reason that some people take donkey sentences to be neither true nor false in contexts, in mixed contexts, is precisely because they have asked their informants or themselves for judgments about these sentences in the absence of a clear question under discussion, and in the absence of any information that would allow them or their informants to reconstruct the question under discussion. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier that Krish assumes that there needs to be a certain alignment between sentences and the questions under discussion that they answer. And this can allow hearers to reconstruct enough information about the question under discussion in many cases that they can then decide whether the sentence is true enough or not for current purposes. So essentially what we are saying is when there is no question under discussion that has been explicitly uttered, then hearers will do their best to reconstruct and infer one. And if they cannot do that, then they will either hesitate to give a truth to give truth conditions to sentences in mixed scenarios, or they will fall back on some default strategies that I'll briefly talk about in a few moments. And as for the other question, or the other part of the question, what if there's more than one question in a discussion? We haven't thought about this case. And as far as I know, there is not much work, maybe not any work, that considers the way in which people consider different candidate questions under discussion and zero in on one of them. I should correct that. There is some work I know of by Justine Cao in the RSA framework, and I'm sure there may be papers that I'm overlooking at this point. But overall, this theory I'm presenting today is dependent to a large extent on a background theory of questions under discussion that tells us for any given sentence and context what the question under discussion is. So great question. Thank you very much. Any other questions?
There is a related question, but I think you somehow answered it, is how do you find the ideal question under discussion in each context, in a context?
Yes, so as you say, it is a similar question. It is not a question that we answer in the paper. And the only work that I know of that answers something like it, like I said, this is a paper by Justine Cao and co-authors. It appeared, I think, in 2014. Essentially assumes that that speakers and hearers have several candidate questions under discussion in mind, and then they look at the sentence and they infer its truth value and its informativity under the different questions under discussion that could be that are at play and that could be the right one. And then they optimize for certain measures. I think truthfulness and informativity are among them in order to pick the most likely one. This is an off the bat summary. I may not be doing justice to that important paper, but this is as far as I'll go right now. Like I said, our paper itself assumes a background theory that provides us with QUDs, and it assumes, as Krish does, a few constraints, like the QUD alignment constraint, which may allow hearers to infer some features of a QUD to some extent.
There is
Okay,
another.
great. Yes.
There is another question which is related to a question that was already asked, I think. But what happens if you don't have an overt adverb of quantification? I mean, if you have a bear. So that's. I think we go back to that.
Right. Okay. So I think this question might be asked with sentences in mind, like if a farmer owns a donkey, he beats it. So this is a conditional donkey sentence. We haven't talked about them. Well, I haven't talked about them today. Our theory in principle applies to them as well. Now, so specifically about what happens when there is no overt adverb, just thinking on my feet right now, I believe that the consensus is that when there is no overt adverb in a conditional, it is as if there was a silent always, so that the sentence would be equivalent to if a farmer owns a donkey, he always beats it, as opposed to he sometimes or he usually beats it. Okay. Now there is a now when we look at the truth conditions of donkey sentences with adverbs, there is a separate problem that arises called the proportion problem. And this gives rise to an ambiguity that is actually different from the existential universal ambiguity. And some people argue that this proportion ambiguity only arises in donkey sentences with conditionals, and then other people believe that they can detect this same ambiguity also in donkey sentences embedded by determinists, like the ones we've looked at today. In any case, the talk today sets aside the proportion problem and the ambiguity that goes along with it in order to focus squarely on the existential universal ambiguity. There are theories that explain how the proportion ambiguity is resolved. I think one of them is found in Vivo and Clark 2008, and others are found in the literature referred to in that book. So everything I say today is compatible with these theories, but doesn't add to them, because the existential universal ambiguity, which we're focusing on here, is different from the proportion ambiguity. Okay.
Could you clarify why, what is the difference between the truth value gaps and presuppositions? Why they are not presuppositions?
Sure. So the reason that truth value gaps in donkey sentences are not presuppositions is the following. Take a sentence with a presupposition in it, like John stopped smoking. So here the presupposition is that John used to smoke. Now, if we accommodate this presupposition, we essentially take it on board. That is, we say the accommodated sentence is equivalent to something like John used to smoke and he no longer does. Now, this sentence is only true if the presupposition of John stopped smoking is true. And otherwise, it is false. That is to say, if the sentence John stopped smoking is neither true nor false, so if it's a presupposition failure, then the accommodated sentence John used to smoke and he no longer does is plain false. So presupposition accommodation amounts to filling the truth value gap that arises from a presupposition with falsity. There is no case in which a presupposition is accommodated the other way, at least no case I know of. And what I mean by this is I don't know of any case in which a sentence that has a presupposition attached to it is accommodated by filling the truth value gap with true. What would it mean if that was possible? Take again the sentence, John stopped smoking. Consider the presupposition of that sentence again. John used to smoke. Okay. And now let's consider a scenario in which this presupposition does not hold. So a scenario in which John did not used to smoke. What it would mean to fill the truth value gap of John stopped smoking with truth is for it to be interpreted in the following way. Either John used to smoke and no longer does, or he never smoked and still no longer does. And this doesn't happen. It doesn't happen with John stopped smoking. It doesn't happen with the King of France is bald. It doesn't happen with any sentence involving presuppositions that I know of. By contrast, sentences involving homogeneity, like definite plurals, and if we write like donkey sentences, routinely give rise to truth value gaps that are filled with truth rather than with falsity. In other words, it is common for homogeneity to be, if you will, accommodated. We haven't used that word, but to be accommodated not by conjoining the gap with the cases in which a sentence is true, but by disjoining it. So remember, conjoining amounts to filling with falsity. Disjoining amounts to filling with truth. Homogeneity results in gaps that can be filled either way. Presupposition amounts to truth value gaps that can be filled only with falsity. Thank you for this question. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to stress this point. Okay, let me go on. There's a little bit I want to talk about more, some additional assumptions. Somebody asked, what happens if the QED isn't given? Or we might say if the QED isn't clear. Well, at this point, we have a theory that says essentially the following. It says that a sentence like every farmer who owns a donkey beats it means something like the actual world is equivalent for current purposes to a world in which every farmer who owns a donkey beats all of his donkeys. Now, what does this mean exactly? What does it mean for the actual world to be equivalent for current purposes, for purposes of the QED, to such a world? Well, if the QED isn't clear, we cannot tell if two worlds are equivalent for the purposes of the QED. So what should we do if we, as hearers, are not clear about what the QED is? Well, here's a reasonable strategy that we'd like to suggest is operative in some cases, not in all cases, but sometimes. The strategy can be summarized as be conservative. And what that means is if you have two worlds and it's not clear if these two worlds count as equivalent for the purposes of the QED, let's just assume that they're not. Except if there are reasons other than whatever the QED itself might be that force you to go in a different direction. For example, we mentioned that Krish assumes, and we assume with Krish, that sentences need to be aligned with their QEDs. That means the QED cannot make two worlds equivalent if the sentence is semantically true in one of them and semantically false in the other. Okay, so if we're not sure about what the QED might be, we're going to say, okay, we're going to assume that whatever the QED is, it aligns with the sentence. Okay, what does this mean concretely? It means if you hear a donkey sentence embedded by every, like every farmer who owns a donkey beats it, and you're not sure what the QED is, and you're conservative, and you're not going to postulate equivalences between worlds where you don't have to, what this amounts to is that you will say, essentially, that the actual world is equivalent to one in which every farmer who owns a donkey beats all of his donkeys, and the only way that the actual world can be equivalent to such a world is by being such a world, because otherwise you wouldn't know if the two distinct worlds really are equivalent or not. Okay, so in other words, you're going to assume that the sentence embedded by every amounts to saying every farmer who owns a donkey beats all of his donkeys. You're going to assume a universal reading. And for analogous reasons, in the other case, in the case where the embedding determiner is no, as in no father of a 10-year-old gives him the car keys, or no farmer who owns a donkey beats it, if you're not sure what counts as equivalent, you're going to default to an existential reading, the one that can be paraphrased as no man who has a son gives any of his sons the car keys. No farmer who owns a donkey beats any of his donkeys. Now, if we assume this, we essentially say that certain determiners give rise to default universal readings, like every. Certain determiners give rise to default existential readings, like no. And overall, these defaults correspond, by and large, to what people have claimed to be the defaults for donkey sentences, with one important exception. The exception is intersective quantifiers. An intersective quantifier is something like one farmer, or at least one farmer, or for that matter, 3 farmers, if we understand this as at least 3 farmers. That is not even necessarily the case. So basically, intersective quantifiers are those that look like numerals. There's a few others as well. Now, intersective quantifiers that embed donkey sentences, by and large, give rise to existential readings. Some people have claimed that they only give rise to existential readings. We take issue with this in the paper. We give examples that involve universal readings, but we agree that the default for intersective quantifiers is existential readings. For example, the default for a sentence like at least one farmer who owns a donkey beats it is to interpret this as saying at least one farmer who owns a donkey beats one of his donkeys. In other words, he doesn't have to beat all of his donkeys. Why is this? Well, you might think that the conservative strategy that I just outlined gives us this behavior, but it doesn't. So we need a fix. And I don't want to go into details about this fix, but luckily in the literature, there has been a proposal that motivates exactly the kind of fix we need. And we're taking it on board here. And the proposal is that for intersective quantifiers only, speakers can leave certain entities out of the model that is being discussed and interpret the sentence on the submodel, that is the resulting model without these individuals. For example, if we're talking about a model with several farmers and several donkeys in it, and we have a sentence with an intersective quantifier, then we can interpret this sentence on a model that leaves out some of the donkeys in question. For example, if there's a farmer who owns 2 donkeys, and he beats one of them but not the other, we are allowed to ignore the second donkey, to leave that donkey out of our model, and to interpret the sentence on the model without the donkey that's not beaten. Now, as a result, the universal reading and the existential reading will collapse. They will both be true. So what this means is that they will be indistinguishable from one another. What looks like an existential reading could in fact be a universal reading interpreted on a model that leaves out some donkeys. And that's because when you say something like all of the donkeys in the submodel, that corresponds to at least some of the donkeys in the original model. That's the intuitive idea here. Why does this happen only for intersective quantifiers? Hertz talks about it in detail. The basic idea is that intersective quantifiers are special in that usually when you don't have a donkey sentence, when all you have is an intersective quantifier, like at least one farmer is rich, for example, usually it is okay to leave out individuals of the model in the sense that the truth conditions of the sentence will not change. If it was true, it will remain true in the submodel. Or maybe I said that the wrong way. If it was false, it will remain false in the submodel. In any case, it is a useful, a psycholinguistically motivated strategy. And this is why Hertz suggests it, and we endorse it as well. So this is a little fix that's needed in order to get the right predictions for donkey sentences embedded by intersective quantifiers. Okay. Roberta, are there any questions at this point?
Yes, there's another one, but I think we should leave it to the end because it's, again, I think a more general question.
Sure. Okay. So as I mentioned, the paper talks about a compositional implementation, a semantics that gives us truth value gaps. Here, I won't talk about the semantics in detail. So you can think of the semantics essentially as a black box or a green box, as I have it on this slide. It delivers a trivalent truth value, which serves as the input to the pragmatics, which turns the trivalent truth value into a bivalent one. That is, it eliminates neither. And just so you know what the semantics looks like, just to give you a bit of a sense of what's inside this green box, it essentially looks like this. We use a dynamic semantics. We cycle over all farmers, X. We read in the relative clause who owns a donkey. As we do this, we create all assignment functions with it that have a donkey that X owns. We then pass one of these assignment functions to the verb phrase, beats it. And then we do the same thing again, but this time we pass all of the assignment functions to the verb phrase. What this means is, essentially, we first check whether it's enough if the farmer beats one donkey. We then check what happens when the farmer beats all donkeys. If the sentence comes out true either way, then we return true. If the sentence comes out as false either way, then we return false. And if the sentence comes out true in one way, but false in the other, that is to say, if we are in a mixed scenario, then we return the truth value neither. And again, for details of the implementation, please have a look at the paper in Semantics and Pragmatics. Let me wrap up. It has been argued before that definite plurals and donkey sentences can be given a uniform pragmatic treatment. But as we've seen at the outside of the talk, we cannot simply say that this is because donkey pronouns are equivalent, semantically speaking, to definite plurals. That's because donkey pronouns are incompatible with collective predicates like gather, but definite plurals are compatible with them. In order to avoid this, we have said that the parallel between donkey sentences and definite plurals is at the level of the entire sentence and at the level of the pragmatics, not at the level of the noun phrases like the pronouns and the definite plurals. We've leveraged a theory by Krisch and a theory by Muskens, compositional DRT, which I haven't talked about today, in order to deliver trivalent semantics compositionally and then pass them on to the pragmatics, which fills the gap with truth or with falsity. We also explain why mixed scenarios make people hesitate. I talked about this in the answer to one of the questions. If you are presented with a donkey sentence without a question under discussion, and if there's not enough context for you to infer what that question might be, then you might either be conservative and default to a certain reading, or you might just not be sure. Once again, what do we predict in plain English for a sentence like everyone who owns a donkey pays taxes on it? It means, according to us, the actual world is equivalent for current purposes, that is, for purposes of the question under discussion, to a world in which everyone who owns a donkey pays taxes on all of his donkeys. And this can be the case because everybody, in fact, pays taxes on all of his donkeys, because every world is equivalent to itself. Or it can be the case because even though not everybody pays taxes on all of his donkeys, still things are equivalent to what would be the case if everyone did pay taxes on all of his donkeys. What it means to be equivalent will depend on the context. If the law allows you to skip some of your donkeys and pay taxes only on the others, the sentence will get an existential interpretation. If the law is or is assumed to be such that you have to pay taxes on all your donkeys, then the sentence is interpreted universally. A sentence like no one with an umbrella leaves at home means something like the actual world is equivalent for current purposes to one in which no one with an umbrella leaves all of his umbrellas home. And what it means for two worlds to be equivalent in this case could be whether people stay dry or not. And if that's the question under discussion, then it doesn't matter if the owner of two umbrellas takes both of their umbrellas along or only one of them, because either way they stay dry. And so this accounts for the reading of the sentence, which is a universal reading in this case. Now, if we are right, then a lot of the disagreement in the literature on donkey sentences is spurious. That is to say, the disagreement on whether the donkey pronoun is existential or universal, or whether there is a default existential reading, but the other one is also available, or a default universal reading. A lot of that disagreement comes from the fact that we have not controlled for the question under discussion when we asked ourselves and our informants about intuitions about the truth conditions of donkey sentences in mixed scenarios. On the picture that we've drawn here, much of semantics leaves gaps for pragmatics to fill. And now we've talked only about donkey sentences here and about definite plurals. But there's a lot of other areas in semantics where this general strategy might be fruitful. And somebody mentioned bare plurals at the outset. People have talked about similar phenomena. For example, Peterson Westerstall compare a sentence like most cars' tires were slashed with a possessive in it with a sentence like most cars' tires were intact. So here it seems that there is a similar phenomenon going on where in order for the sentence most cars' tires were slashed to be true, it seems to be enough if most cars are such that at least one of the tires on that car was slashed. So that's an existential interpretation. But in order for sentence 2 to be true, it seems to be the case, it seems to be necessary that most cars have all of their tires intact. So that's a universal interpretation. If we are right, and if our account can be extended to these kinds of cases, and I don't see why it couldn't, then this is because possessives deliver a trivalent semantics to a pragmatics which fills the gap with truth or falsity depending on the question under discussion. And if this phenomenon is pervasive, then this means we cannot take semantic judgments at face value, because nobody really knows how people fill in questions under discussion if we don't state them explicitly. We've given a few suggestions. We've suggested that if you're not sure, be conservative, assume that no two worlds are equivalent unless you have to. We've also suggested that some people might just be hesitant. And we've suggested that that accounts for some of the uncertainty surrounding donkey sentences that were presented out of context. Now, there's also a hard question, which concerns the status of homogeneity. And I've touched on this in response to one of the questions. What I said is that presuppositions can be accommodated, and what it means to accommodate a presupposition, and here I mean global accommodation, is to conjoin the presupposition to the sentence. But filling a truth value gap with truth is essentially equivalent to disjoining it to the sentence. And that's because conjoining removes worlds, but disjoining adds worlds. Let me also mention the connection to vagueness, which has been pointed out to me from time to time by various people. The account that we're giving is similar to trivalent accounts of vagueness in that a sentence like John is bald is often assumed to have a trivalent semantics as well, in the sense that if John has no hair on his head at all, he is clearly bald. If he has a lot of hair, he is clearly not bald. And if he is in the zone in between having no hair and having a lot of hair, then he counts as neither bald nor not bald. And then depending on the context, it may turn out that he counts as bald for current purposes or not. So there is a connection to these accounts, specifically to supervaluationist accounts. This connection would become clearer if I presented the semantic component of our theory in more detail. But let me emphasize an important difference between the sentences I've talked about today and vague sentences. Vague sentences have many precisifications. What that means is there are essentially many ways at which you can draw the line between what it counts as being bald and what counts as not being bald. For us, a verb phrase like beats it has only two precisifications. It can mean beats all of them. It can mean beats some of them. We don't countenance semantic values in between these two. We don't say that the semantics could deliver something like beats half of them. That is a job of the pragmatics. What that means for those interested in vagueness is there is no way to create a Sorites paradox using donkey sentences. So homogeneity is different from vagueness. It's different from presupposition failure. It's an altogether different kind of animal. And if we are right, it could be fairly pervasive in natural language. Now I'd like to end with a proverb which my wife, who is Turkish, told me. God makes his favorite subject first lose his donkey and then find it again. And I'd like to point out that actually this proverb is a donkey sentence. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Lucas, for this nice presentation. So we do have a couple of questions. I'm going to read them, but I think it's better.
Sure.
So the first one is the singular pronoun sometimes triggers pointwise uniqueness. Everyone who wrote a paper on homogeneity will present it here. Mm-hmm. Sounds odd if someone wrote more than one. Is this predicted by what you were saying?
Thank you. This is a great question. It has been observed early on in the literature on donkey sentences that certain donkey sentences seem to presuppose uniqueness in exactly this sense. Not that there is only one paper total, but that there is only one paper per person who submitted papers. We believe this is not the case in general, but and in this I should say we are not the only ones. So by and large, the semantic literature has moved away from the idea that donkey sentences as a whole, as a class, presuppose uniqueness in this sense. However, it cannot be denied that there is this intuition, at least for certain donkey sentences. So the question is, can we make sense of why people have this intuition? And can we make sense of why they don't always have it? So first, consider a sentence like the one you mentioned where people do have the uniqueness intuition. In any scenario that satisfies the uniqueness condition, the existential reading and the universal reading will collapse. They will both lead to the same truth values, assuming that universal quantifiers have existential import. And in fact, there's not even a need to assume that. So for illustration, imagine that we are in a scenario where every farmer who owns any donkeys at all owns only one donkey. Now, this kind of scenario cannot be mixed. It cannot give rise to the kind of ambiguity that I started this talk with. Now, I also mentioned that we suggest that people who interpret donkey sentences out of context and who are unable to reconstruct enough about the context that they could guess what the question and discussion is, will sometimes hesitate and vacillate. And one way in which they can hesitate could express itself in the kinds of intuitions that semanticists call a presupposition failure. So we don't say that donkey sentences have presuppositions. We don't say that there is any kind of uniqueness requirement. We do say that in sentences that are presented in contexts which satisfy the uniqueness requirement, there will never be any uncertainty of the kind that arises from the need to figure out, is this an existential reading? Is this a universal reading? Or to put it differently, if uniqueness is satisfied, the semantics will always deliver a classical truth value. It will always deliver either true or false, never neither. And there will be no need for the pragmatics to fill the gap with either truth or falsity. So what we would like to suggest is that donkey sentences can give the occasion for people to hesitate or vacillate for various reasons. Several things need to come together for people to hesitate. First, the scenario has to be mixed, so it can't be a uniqueness scenario. And second, the question under discussion needs to be unclear. To put it differently, there can be several ways in which people can be very clear about their intuitions. And one way is if the question under discussion is clear or can be clearly inferred. Another way is if there is no need to infer one because the scenario satisfies uniqueness. And so in this way, we can sort of explain the intuitions on both sides. Those of the people who said all donkey sentences presuppose uniqueness, well, they're partially right. In that if you do have uniqueness, there is no way for a homogeneity there's no way for homogeneity to arise. And we also explain why some people say, no, not all donkey sentences presuppose uniqueness. Because when the donkey sentence makes its context clear or comes with a clear context, then it will have a clear truth value, pragmatically speaking, even in mixed scenarios, even in those that don't presuppose uniqueness. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Okay, so I have another question. I think it's a more general question. I'm going to read it. Can we suppose that donkey sentences would cognitively bound by pragmatics network in our mind? And there is an, is it possible that our minds leave empty the boundness network between donkey sentences and pragmatics until I will encounter in the actual world for the determinate the boundness? I'm not sure if I get
Thank you.
it.
Yes, I think I see what the gist of the question is. So I think the suggestion is that when we interpret donkey sentences, in situations where the context is clear, so either because the sentence is actually used in daily life, or because it has been presented in a context that has plenty of information in it, then is it possible that we go in 2 stages as we process the sentence, where the first stage corresponds to the semantics, and the question, what are things like at the actual world, doesn't enter the semantics. And then only the second stage involves asking what things are like at the actual world. And I might add, if we're right, it also involves asking what things are like at other worlds than the actual world that correspond to the actual world or not. And I think that's plausible. Now, we haven't proposed a theory of processing. So I wouldn't endorse this idea outright without thinking more about its implications. But I think I like the idea because, so I haven't stressed it today, but there's a difference between sentences and utterances, as we know. So utterances are sentences in context. Semantics is about the meaning of sentences. Pragmatics is about the meaning of utterances. Pragmatics only makes sense once you have a context, but semantics can be carried out in the absence of context. So in that sense, I think the suggestion in the question is quite plausible. Thank you.
Okay. I do have a question myself. I found it very interesting, but how do you know when you have this gap? How does the machine work in a sense? Because how do I know that, oh, this is possible, that I may have a gap here or not? Right?
I'm sorry, could you elaborate on the question a little bit?
Like, for instance, okay, let me see if I can. And you said that, for instance, for the donkey sentences, we have to take into account the fact that sometimes we have neither false nor true, right?
Right.
And that may also happen with the definite plural, right? So we know that with those guys, somehow maybe I have to count on the fact that, okay, the semantics has to generate the truth conditions, but there is also a gap in a sense. So you have to have the possibility of a gap.
Yes.
And you also suggest that might be with other things like the bare plurals, maybe you have that as well. So how do I know when can I have this truth value gap?
Oh, I see.
So in the way that that you are proposing. That's okay. What I. Yeah.
So basically, as a scientist, how can I identify other cases of sentences that have gaps in them that might be amenable to the same kind of analysis?
I would say like the speaker. I mean, like.
Oh, as a speaker.
Yeah, as a speaker, not really as like. Does the grammar tell me? Okay, here are the cases where you are going to have gaps, and those are cases where you are not going to have gaps, or this is not really the grammar that is giving. It's not the grammar that is generating that. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Well, so the way that we think about the source of the gaps is in terms of the semantics. So this is a part of the talk that I didn't present much here, but maybe I can find a slide that shows what I have in mind. So basically, we put the gap, we put the source of the gap in the embedding quantifiers. And we have reasons to do this. Other people have put the source of the gap somewhere else, and we talk about why we do what we do in the paper, but this is a basic idea. Let me share my screen again, if that's not already the case.
It's not, we are not, yeah.
Okay.
Now it is, okay.
Okay, good. So here's an ordinary quantifier. Every A is a B. It's true if the circle corresponding to the A's is within the circle corresponding to the B's. And it's false otherwise. Okay, now here's the idea behind a supervaluation quantifier. In a supervaluation quantifier, one or both of these circles can have fuzzy boundaries. And let's say that circle B has fuzzy boundaries, like this. So we don't really know where the boundary is. So we don't know exactly what counts as being a B. But if the circle that stands for the A's is entirely inside the fuzzy circle, then we can say that even though we don't know exactly what counts as being a B, we can say that every A is a B. Or if there are some things inside A that are definitely outside B, and we can say that it's definitely false that every A is a B. But if the circle for A is kind of straddling the boundary between B's and non-B's, and if this boundary is fuzzy, either because we don't know exactly where it is or because there's no fact of the matter as to where it is, then it depends whether every A is a B. It depends on what counts as a B. And so what we suggest is that a verb phrase like beats it gives rise to this fuzziness, so that a scenario in which a farmer owns multiple donkeys and beats all of them clearly falls into the denotation of the verb phrase beats it. A farmer that owns multiple donkeys and beats none of them clearly falls outside of the denotation. And a farmer that owns multiple donkeys and beats some of them but not the others might be inside the denotation of the verb phrase and might be outside. And so in this way, we suggest that the semantics of the verb phrase beats it, and really this is because of the semantics of the pronoun, is imprecise. It's imprecise in a similar way to the semantics of vague predicates, except that, as I said, we suggest that it can be made precise in exactly two ways, whereas vague predicates can be made precise in any number of ways. So this is the answer to your question then. In order to know where the gaps are, so to speak, you need to look at the denotations of the words, or if you prefer, part of what it is to know the meaning of the pronoun it is to know that it is fuzzy in this way. Or you could also put it in a different way. Part of what it means to know the meaning of it is to not know exactly what its meaning is. Whether you're aware of this or not is another matter. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the clarification. Can I just ask another question?
Sure.
We don't have any other questions from the audience. So if you have any other question, just please make it. But since we don't have, yeah, I understand it now. So it has a lot to do with supervaluation, in fact, right? And
right,
fuzziness, yes, and vagueness. And you are trying to say that, okay, it's not really the same phenomena as vagueness, because with precification, we have many alternatives. But when we have like donkey sentences or the VP of donkey sentences with the pronoun, then we just have two situations, right? But I think that, yeah, that maybe, but with the definite plural, you would have more than one situation, right? If I understand it correctly, right? So then we would be even closer to this supervaluation idea or precification idea, right?
Right. Great question. Thank you. So, so the question, as I understand it, is: are we really sure that there's only two ways of making the VP denotation precise? Why couldn't there be more? Because after all, in the case of definite plurals, it looks like in some contexts we interpret a definite plural as something that's neither all the doors nor some of the doors. Maybe it could be at least two of the doors, as I think you asked me about earlier. And so that's a possibility. We've looked into that and we've considered it, and we did not endorse it in the end. And the reason, there are two reasons. One reason is that if we endorsed it, if we essentially said that beats it is multiply fuzzy and not just two ways fuzzy, then leaving everything else in the theory the way it currently is, we would then generate not only universal existential readings, but also additional readings in between as far as the semantics is concerned. Now, keeping in mind that these verb phrases are taken to occur in all kinds of contexts, not just in the context of embedding determiners, so they can be used outside of donkey sentences as well. This has consequences in the grammar outside of donkey sentences that are undesirable. And even within donkey sentences, and within definite plurals for that matter, it turns out that it is not necessary to postulate this kind of multiple fuzziness or multiple ways of making the meanings of verb phrases precise. And that's because the pragmatics can do so itself. So in the scenarios that I've described, I've painted a simplified picture, one in which there is only one world in the gap. And either that world is equivalent to a world on the left, or it is equivalent to a world on the right. Now, that's a simplification. In practice, there will be more than one world in the gap. The sentence will leave open which world we're in, even once we fix the truth value, the semantic truth value of the sentence. And depending on the question under discussion, it may well be that among the worlds in which the sentence is neither true nor false, semantically speaking, there will be some that are equivalent to a world at which it is semantically true, and others that are not. And in that case, we would have a context in which the sentence is in effect interpreted as having neither an existential reading nor a universal reading, but something in between. And this would come from the pragmatics together with the semantics as we currently have it, even though the semantics itself is built on only two ways of making the VP precise. We talk about this in the paper, and we talk about some examples in which we might have, well, I think we talk, there was a draft in which we talked about it. I don't know if it's a published version, but we have definitely thought about contexts in which the pragmatics fills some of the gap with truth and the remainder of the gap with falsity. And we've also speculated about why this doesn't seem to happen in random ways, why this is not as pervasive as one might expect it based on everything else we've said about the pragmatics. Oh, I think you're muted.
So I think it's going to be the last question.
Okay.
The interpretation of known C command binding in "No boy's mother thinks he is a genius" is not question under discussion dependent like Duncan anaphora. Does this mean that such cases are not instances of discourse binding?
Let me think about this one for a second. So we can find sentences that are parallel to this one and that I think give rise to the same kind of ambiguities that I've talked about today. So take, for example, no 10-year-old's mother gives him the car keys, or every donkey's owner beats it. So I would actually submit that, I mean, I'm not a native speaker, but I would expect that these kinds of sentences do show the same phenomenon as ordinary donkey sentences. Now, keep in mind that if you look at an isolated case, it's fairly likely that the sentence will contain enough information implicitly about the context and will allow you to reconstruct a question and a discussion, or at least the outlines of a question and a discussion. And that will then lead you to interpret the sentence in one way or in the other. And that means that you might feel that the sentence is unambiguous. So there really isn't a way to look at a single sentence and conclude from the lack of ambiguity in that sentence that an entire class of sentences with its structure lack the ambiguity that we've seen in donkey sentences.
Okay, thank you very much. We still have like some couple of minutes. Any more questions? No. Okay, so I don't think we have any more questions. Let me check.
Okay.
Once again. No. So maybe, okay. So thank you very much for your presentation. It was really nice. Thank you for the audience for the participation and for the questions.
Thank you so much, Roberta. Thank you so much for moderating. And I also want to thank the audience. I want to thank my co-authors once again, Dylan Bumford and Robert Henderson, who have developed this theory together with me. And I want to thank Abralin for sponsoring and running this show, as well as the Linguistic Society of America and the other organizations involved. It's an honor to speak here. It's been a great experience for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And